second. West
That's NBA playoff action Friday night at 11.
On November 13, 1979, in a road arena in Kansas City, a basketball hoop exploded. For one frozen second, nobody in the building understood what they had just seen. Then the sound caught up with the sight. A deep crack, followed by the high, scattering chime of glass hitting hardwood. Players backed away with their arms half raised, the way people instinctively flinch from something they cannot yet name. Referees stood still, whistles hanging uselessly around their necks, because there was no rule written yet for what to do when the equipment itself simply gives up. At the center of all of it stood a 6'11", 251-pound man, smiling like he had just told the best joke of his life. His name was Daryl Dawkins. They called him Chocolate Thunder, and long before the league figured out how to stop him from breaking its equipment, he had already broken something quieter and more stubborn. The idea of what a basketball player was supposed to be, how he was supposed to look, and how seriously he was required to take himself while doing it. It happened at a strange moment in the league's own history. The NBA of the late 1970s was not yet the global entertainment machine it would later become. Television ratings were thin. Finals games were sometimes shown on tape delay, well after midnight, because network executives did not trust the sport to carry a live primetime audience. The league had only recently absorbed several franchises from a rival circuit, and it was still working out, in real time, what kind of product it actually wanted to sell to the country. Into that uncertain landscape walked a teenager who refused to be quiet, refused to be modest, and refused to pretend that joy and dominance could not occupy the same body at the same time. Long before anyone built a marketing department around personality, Daryl Dawkins was already living proof that personality could fill an arena just as easily as a jump shot could. To understand why a grown man could shatter a backboard and laugh about it, you have to go back to a smaller story, one without cameras or crowds. Daryl Dawkins grew up in Orlando, Florida, one of 11 children in a household where money was a constant, quiet pressure. His mother and his grandmother worked without rest just to keep the family fed and housed. There was no slow, comfortable runway in that life. There was no room for a 4-year detour through college basketball, gaining seasoning a half step at a time while someone else worried about the bills. For Daryl Dawkins, there was only the chance right now, today, to do something that might change the trajectory of his family's life for good. Most teenagers who are good at a sport get to think about that sport as a sport, a game with rules and seasons and rivalries. Dawkins, by necessity, had to think about basketball as something closer to a job with a deadline attached, one that needed to start paying immediately. Because the people who had raised him had been waiting their whole lives for a break that finally looked like it might be real. At Maynard Evans High School, he was already something the sport had rarely seen. A fully grown man's body wearing a teenager's jersey. He averaged 32 points and 21 rebounds a game and carried his team to a state championship. The kind of dominance that usually takes years to develop and somehow, in his case, had arrived all at once. Veteran scouts who had walked through hundreds of gyms across the country came away stunned. One of them, a longtime evaluator named Tom McMahon, said flatly that Dawkins already had the body of a 25-year-old man, someone who could put up 44 points even with 2 defenders draped across his shoulders. It is one thing to be told you are talented. It is another to have grown men who have seen everything tell you, quietly, that they have genuinely never seen anything quite like you before. Word of that kind travels fast inside basketball circles, and by the time Dawkins finished his final high school season, NBA scouts were no longer asking whether he belonged at the next level. They were only asking how soon he could get there. So Dawkins faced a decision that almost no 18-year-old in America was being asked to make. He could follow the path everyone expected, attend college, build his game patiently away from the spotlight, and arrive in the NBA polished and ready. Or he could skip all of it, walk straight into professional basketball untested, and start providing for the people who had raised him immediately, without waiting for some imagined perfect moment in the future. He chose his family. In 1975, Daryl Dawkins became the first player in the modern draft era to leap directly from a high school gymnasium into the first round of the NBA draft. Philadelphia selected him 5th overall, behind David Thompson, David Myers, Marvin Webster, and Alvin Adams. The contract that came with it was worth $1 million over 7 years, an almost unthinkable sum for a teenager. With it, he bought his mother a house and pulled her out of public housing for good. He helped pay tuition for siblings and cousins who might never otherwise have made it to college themselves. At 18 years old, Darryl Dawkins had already done something that takes most men an entire working lifetime to accomplish for their families. The NBA, however, was not interested in any of that. The league did not care what his contract had purchased for the people he loved. It wanted to know exactly one thing: could he play, right now, at this level, against grown men who had been doing this for years? For 2 full seasons, the organization's answer was a patient. Frustrating not yet. He sat at the end of the bench. He watched veterans who had earned their minutes the long way, year by year, take the court ahead of him. And the entire time, one word followed him everywhere he went, repeated by coaches, writers, and front office executives, until it lost any resemblance to a compliment. Potential, it sounds, on its surface like praise. In practice, for Darryl Dawkins, it became something closer to a cage, a word people used again and again to explain why what he was already doing on the floor still somehow wasn't enough to satisfy them. It is a peculiar kind of pressure, being told repeatedly that the best version of yourself still has not arrived, even as you are visibly doing things on a basketball court that nobody your age had ever managed before. Other players got to be judged on what they produced. Dawkins, for years, got judged against a version of himself that existed only in other people's imaginations. A hypothetical ceiling nobody could quite describe, but everyone seemed certain he had not yet reached. Philadelphia, as a city and as a franchise, had seen a player like this before, or at least it believed it had. The comparisons to Wilt Chamberlain began almost from the moment Dawkins put on a Sixers uniform. Same city, same impossible physical scale, the same sense that basketball's rules might simply need to bend around him. Surely, the thinking went, this was the next one. Dawkins pushed back hard against that framing, and he had good reason to. Chamberlain stood taller still, was built on an entirely different physical scale, and had become a once-in-a-generation outlier even measured against other outliers. Chamberlain had also accumulated years of seasoning and refinement that Dawkins, plucked straight out of a high school gym, had simply never been given the chance to earn. Being measured against a legend before anyone had let him become a finished basketball player felt, to Dawkins, like a deeply unfair trade. Expectation handed to him in advance of opportunity. He would sometimes point out with a flash of genuine frustration beneath the usual humor that nobody had asked Chamberlain to be great at 18 fresh out of high school, with no college seasons behind him to smooth out the rough edges first. Off the court, Dawkins refused to make himself smaller or quieter to fit anybody's picture of what a serious professional athlete was supposed to look like. He wore neon-colored suits loud enough to stop conversation in a room. He carried a boombox that weighed 70 pounds as though it weighed nothing at all. His home answering machine greeted callers with a line that, within certain NBA circles, became almost as famous as his on-court highlights. "This is the Doc, and I'm ready to talk." He invented elaborate, theatrical names for his dunks, a habit he started in 1976 as a deliberate way of carving out his own identity on a roster already filled with established stars. The Heartstopper, the Cake Shaker, the Spine Chiller Supreme. Long before athletes thought of themselves in terms of personal brands, sponsorship decks, and curated public personas, Darryl Dawkins was already doing something that resembled it instinctively, treating each highlight as a small piece of performance art with its own title card. Front office executives did not always know what to make of any of this. General manager Pat Williams felt that Dawkins approached his career like a big lark, as if he never fully absorbed how seriously the business of professional basketball was supposed to be taken. It was an odd kind of criticism to level at a player who had, after all, signed a $1 million contract specifically to take care of a family that desperately needed taking care of. But front offices in that era were not always equipped to see seriousness when it didn't look the way they expected seriousness to look. The man sitting above Williams in the organization felt that frustration even more sharply. Owner Harold Katz had little patience for what he dismissively referred to as Dawkins's Levitron stuff, a reference to the imaginary planet Dawkins joked he had originally come from. Katz had no interest in flashy one-handed rebounds or showmanship for its own sake. He wanted production, plain and uncomplicated. He wanted Dawkins, in Katz's own blunt phrase, to play like a man, as though the size of his personality were somehow proof against the seriousness of his game. By the mid-1970s, Philadelphia had assembled a roster that looked, on paper, like it should never lose. Julius Erving had arrived as one of the most electrifying players the sport had ever produced, a man whose game had already become a cultural phenomenon in its own right. George McGinnis brought brute scoring power from the rival league. Dawkins, still only in his early 20s, brought size and spectacle that nobody else in the building could match. Expectations around that team were enormous, perhaps unreasonably so. And when talent that large gets packed onto a single roster without enough structure to organize it, the pressure tends to find the cracks on its own. In 1977, Philadelphia reached the NBA Finals against Portland, and the matchup quickly became something larger than a basketball series in the eyes of the press. The media framed it almost like a morality play written for the sports pages. Portland, led by Bill Walton's unselfish, team-oriented style, was cast as the embodiment of old-fashioned, fundamentally sound basketball. Philadelphia, with Julius Erving, George McGinnis, and Dawkins on the roster, was cast as something flashier and more dangerous. Individualistic, undisciplined, talent without restraint. That tension boiled over into something physical during Game 2. Dawkins threw a punch in Portland forward Bobby Gross's direction. He missed Gross entirely and instead caught his own teammate, Doug Collins, by accident. Portland's designated enforcer, Maurice Lucas, answered by hitting Dawkins from behind. The two squared off at center court while fans, sensing chaos, poured down out of the stands and onto the floor itself. Both players were ejected from the game. Dawkins carried his anger back into the locker room afterward, and it did not simply dissipate once he was alone. He tore a toilet clean off the wall. He ripped a metal locker stall loose from its mountings. But what stayed with him far longer than any of that physical damage was a quieter, more painful realization about his own teammates. While he was being struck, Julius Erving sat on the floor and did not move. George McGinnis stood and simply watched. Nobody on his own side stepped in to defend him. It was the kind of moment box scores never capture. A team that looked perfectly unified to outsiders watching from the stands and was, underneath that surface, considerably less so. Years later, in his 2003 autobiography Chocolate Thunder, co-written with Charlie Rosen, Dawkins was unflinchingly direct about something else that had shaped those years beneath the surface. A racial double standard running quietly through the league and the way the press covered it. He believed that black players who spoke their minds or who played with visible personality and flair risked being branded as problems, sometimes even risked being pushed toward the margins of the league altogether, while white players engaging in similar behavior were granted far wider latitude to simply be themselves without consequence. Seen through that lens, the neon suits, the boombox, the elaborate dunk names were never just personality for its own sake. They were a black athlete in the late 1970s, insisting on the right to exist exactly as himself, fully visible, inside a sport that was not always certain it wanted to extend him that same freedom. Seen through that lens, the neon suits, the boombox, the elaborate dunk names were never just personality for its own sake. They were a black athlete in the late 1970s, insisting on the right to exist exactly as himself, fully visible, inside a sport that was not always certain it wanted to extend him that same freedom. Dawkins belonged to a wider generation of black athletes coming of age in the shadow of the civil rights movement who had begun to understand that visibility itself could be a form of resistance that's simply refusing to shrink. Refusing to apologize for taking up space carried its own kind of weight, even when nobody framed it in those terms at the time. He was rarely described using language that grand. He was usually just called colorful or flamboyant or difficult, words that softened the politics of what he was actually doing every time he stepped off the team bus in a suit nobody could ignore. By 1982, after 7 full seasons, Harold Katz had run out of patience for waiting on potential to fully arrive. Dawkins' rebounding numbers and his persistent foul trouble had come to look, in Katz's eyes, less like a phase a young player would eventually outgrow and more like a permanent ceiling on what he would ever become. Philadelphia traded him away to the New Jersey Nets. To fill the gap he left behind, Katz pursued the reigning league MVP, Moses Malone, in a blockbuster move that reshaped the franchise overnight. The decision behind that trade was not purely emotional or reactive. The Sixers had run early computer-assisted projections suggesting that simply swapping Dawkins and Caldwell-Jones for Malone alone would add roughly 337 offensive rebounds and nearly 1,400 additional points over the course of a single season. It stands today as one of the earliest known instances of an NBA front office leaning on hard statistical modeling, rather than pure scouting instinct, to justify remaking a championship roster. It stands today as one of the earliest known instances of an NBA front office leaning on hard statistical modeling rather than pure scouting instinct to justify remaking a championship roster. years before the wider sports world would come to embrace that kind of thinking as standard practice. Baseball would not have its own well-known reckoning with statistical analysis for at least another decade. Basketball's executives, for the most part, were still trusting their eyes. Katz's willingness to run the numbers on his own franchise's two best big men and to act decisively once those numbers came back unfavorable was unusual enough at the time that it became its own small piece of organizational lore inside the league. The projections, as it turned out, were not merely accurate. If anything, they understated what actually happened. Malone matched the combined season-long offensive rebounding total that Dawkins and Jones had produced together, and he did it in just his 40th game wearing a Sixers uniform. In the 1982 finals, with Dawkins still anchoring the frontcourt, Philadelphia had been out-rebounded by an average of 6 boards a game and had lost the series. 1 year later, with Malone now occupying the middle of the floor, the Sixers finished the finals A+5 in total rebounding, a swing of more than 12 boards a game in the opposite direction. They swept the Los Angeles Lakers outright and brought home the championship that had eluded them before. Julius Erving later summarized the change in the simplest possible terms. The Dawkins-era Sixers, he said, had been a pretty team. Stylish, entertaining, built around individual flash and highlight moments. Malone's teams were not pretty in that same sense. Bodies flew across the floor without regard for how it looked on a highlight reel. Nobody on that roster cared whether a possession was aesthetically pleasing, only whether it worked and whether it ended in a win. Guard Maurice Cheeks echoed the same idea, saying Malone had injected a kind of relentless aggressiveness into the entire roster's approach to the game, something that simply had not existed there before his arrival. Dawkins himself never pretended he could match that particular brand of relentlessness. He once compared the experience of guarding Malone in the low post to fighting some kind of creature, with tentacles, a mollusk, in his own memorable phrase describing Malone's hands as feeling like flypaper, impossible to shake loose from for even a single second of any given possession. Not every opposing big man needed Malone's brute, physical relentlessness to slow Darryl Dawkins down. Boston's frontcourt in particular treated every meeting with Philadelphia as a kind of proving ground, a series of games where the two storied franchises seemed to be litigating something larger than a single regular season standing. Robert Parrish solved the specific problem Dawkins posed in an entirely different way than Malone had, and the two big men's contrasting styles became a small but memorable subplot inside the larger Celtics-Sixers wars. Parrish never tried to simply overpower Dawkins in the post, muscle against muscle. Instead, he relied on a smooth face-up jumper and near-constant motion, running the floor relentlessly before Dawkins could ever settle his feet into any kind of rhythm. Teammate Tiny Archibald summarized Parrish's approach in one simple, memorable phrase: Parrish kept Dawkins in his pocket. On some nights, that defensive discipline limited Dawkins to one dunk, or none at all, while Parrish quietly scored almost at will at the other end of the floor, unbothered. Then there was Larry Bird, and the two of them produced one of those moments the sport simply refuses to forget. Trying to cut off one of Bird's drives to the basket, Dawkins drove an elbow squarely into his chest. Bird barely reacted to the blow. He got back up, told Dawkins flatly that his own mother hit harder than that, and then went out and scored 50 points that same night, as though to settle the point definitively. But there was a darker, less comic footnote buried inside that same rivalry. In a separate game, a different collision with Dawkins actually displaced Bird's hip entirely. Dawkins, by his own account, had no real sense of how serious that particular injury truly was. He found out only the next morning, reading about it cold in the newspaper over breakfast, and it was only then that he reached out and apologized for something he had not even realized he had done. For all his physical combativeness once the ball was live, Dawkins reserved a surprising amount of genuine warmth for certain teammates once the whistle blew and the game settled into its quieter moments. He believed that Doug Collins, hampered for years by recurring foot injuries that never fully healed, could have been every bit as good as Larry Bird himself if his body had simply allowed it. He credited guard World B, Free as his daily one-on-one sparring partner, the man whose relentless, repetitive battles in empty gyms quietly built up the confidence Dawkins eventually needed to dunk over elite shot blockers like Bill Walton without hesitation. Late in his career, a brief stint with the Detroit Pistons gave Dawkins a front-row seat to a very different model of team chemistry than the one he had known in Philadelphia. He watched the front office trade away Adrian Dantley and noticed a pattern forming around it. Players who did not get along with Isiah Thomas tended not to stay in Detroit for very long. He had his own private verdicts on that particular locker room, too. He saw Rick Mahorn as fundamentally misunderstood, a genuinely decent man, underneath an intimidating reputation, while he considered Bill Laimbeer simply cheap as a competitor. And once landed a kidney punch on him hard enough that Laimbeer reportedly stayed visibly wary of him in every matchup that followed. Return, for a moment, to where this story began. November 13, 1979. Dawkins rises above Kansas City's Bill Robinzine and brings the rim, and the entire backboard along with it, crashing down to the floor with him. Glass scatters in every direction across the hardwood. The game stops completely dead in its tracks, while arena staff figure out what to do with a court that no longer has a working basket on one end. His own coach, before any of this happened, had brushed off his earlier warning about the dunk's force, telling him flatly that it was simply impossible, that even Wilt Chamberlain himself had never managed to break a backboard in a real NBA game. 3 weeks later, on December 4th, Dawkins did it again, this time at home in front of his own crowd at the Philadelphia Spectrum against the San Antonio Spurs, as if to underline that the first instance had been no accident. 2 shattered backboards in the span of 3 weeks was more than enough for the league's leadership. Commissioner Larry O'Brien had clearly seen all he needed to see. He summoned Dawkins to his office in person and made the league's new position unmistakably clear. Break a third backboard, and it would cost him $5,000 and an outright suspension. But a fine alone could not solve the underlying engineering problem, and the league needed a permanent fix that did not depend on simply asking players to dunk more gently. The answer, strangely enough, came from a man with almost no connection to professional basketball at all. A grain elevator worker living in the small town of Loder, Illinois, named Arthur Ehret, had patented a spring-loaded rim built around a leftover heavy spring salvaged from a John Deere farm cultivator. Under enough downward force, the rim would simply bend and flex, then snap cleanly back into its original position, instead of shattering the glass behind it. The design had already made a quiet early appearance at the 1978 NCAA Final Four, years before Dawkins's second shattered backboard forced the issue at the professional level. It was tested for a full season in the Continental Basketball Association, and by the start of the 1981-82 season, the NBA adopted the breakaway rim league-wide, installing it in every arena. The breakaway rim, the same basic design that still hangs in essentially every gym on Earth today, exists in large part because of 2 specific nights in 1979, when one player, smiling the whole time, simply could not be physically stopped by the equipment as it had been built. True to form, Dawkins refused to let even that engineering solution have the final word on the matter. Playing later in Italy, he claimed he managed to break 2 of the new breakaway rims anyway by pulling sideways across the rim, instead of straight down through it, finding the one angle of attack the design's engineers had apparently never accounted for. More than a decade after Dawkins' own rookie seasons, a young Shaquille O'Neal broke an entire hydraulic backboard support system during his own rookie year in the league. O'Neal, when asked about it, did not hesitate to credit exactly where that particular lineage of destruction had started. He called Dawkins the father of power dunking and described himself with real respect as merely one of his many sons. The dunk itself, once treated by purists as a slightly undignified flourish, had by then become one of the league's most marketable assets, eventually earning its own showcase event at All-Star Weekend. None of that evolution happens quite the same way without a teenager from Orlando proving, twice, in front of a national audience, that the act of dunking could carry enough raw force to physically break the sport's own equipment. Dawkins' playing career in the NBA wound down quietly and without much fanfare. A brief, largely unremarkable stretch with the Utah Jazz and then the Detroit Pistons produced little of consequence on the court itself. He went overseas afterward to continue playing professionally in Italy, extending his career for several more seasons before eventually stepping away from the game as a player entirely. European basketball in those years had become something of a second home for aging American big men, a place where size alone could still buy a player several more good seasons, even after his legs had started to slow down on the smaller, faster American courts. Dawkins took to it the way he took to most things, with humor, with showmanship, and with at least 2 more broken rims to his name before he finally hung up his sneakers for good. What came next surprised people who only remembered him as the showman with the neon suits and the boombox. Dawkins quietly became, in his own particular way, a genuine teacher of the sport. In 1999, he served as player coach for the Winnipeg Cyclone of the International Basketball Association, guiding the team to a 22-12 record and earning Co-Coach of the Year honors for his work. A real and substantive accomplishment that rarely makes it into the highlight reels built around his playing days. His life after playing was not without genuinely difficult chapters, the kind that rarely show up in tribute videos. A business venture connected to the Continental Basketball Association cost him roughly $10 million, before that league ultimately folded within about a year and a half of his involvement. A coaching tenure tied to the New York Knicks organization ended amid real controversy, connected to an $11.5 million legal settlement involving documented findings of sexual harassment and verbal abuse. With the Indiana Pacers, his time as head coach ended almost as soon as Larry Bird took over as president of basketball operations and moved swiftly to make a change at the position. A decision that closed one particular chapter of Dawkins's basketball life with very little ceremony. Taken together, these later setbacks paint a more complicated picture than the warm, laughing tribute videos tend to suggest. A reminder that the same fearlessness and refusal to be managed that made him such a singular player did not always translate smoothly into the boardrooms and front offices of professional sports. And yet, despite all of that, the people who actually spent real time with him, on rosters, in locker rooms, at clinics and appearances, kept describing the exact same man, over and over again, almost without variation. Enormous, warm, impossible not to like once you were actually standing in front of him. A booming laugh that seemed to fill an entire room before he had even finished the joke. A handshake that completely swallowed up an average person's whole hand. A presence that somehow put everyone around him at ease almost immediately, whether they happened to be fellow NBA legends standing courtside or simply kids attending one of his youth basketball clinics, even well into retirement. Dawkins never fully softened his strongly held opinions about how the modern game had evolved around him. He felt that certain rule changes, particularly the elimination of hand-checking on defense and the dramatic rise of three-point shooting as a primary offensive weapon, had made life far too easy for today's offensive players compared to the era he had actually played in. He once joked watching a young, towering Victor Wembanyama get knocked around by smaller, more aggressive defenders that modern defenders were lucky Wembanyama had not simply turned around himself and struck one of them across the face in response. It was, on its surface, plainly a joke, but underneath that joke sat Dawkins's genuine, lifelong conviction that real physical toughness had always belonged inside this particular sport, even when that same toughness had occasionally cost him, and others around him, quite a lot along the way. On August 27, 2015, Darryl Dawkins died of a heart attack. He was 58 years old, gone far sooner than anyone who had watched him laugh his way through an entire NBA career could have reasonably expected. Tributes arrived almost immediately from every corner of the basketball world, and nearly all of them circled back to the same essential idea about who he had actually been. Magic Johnson called him the life of the party at every single All-Star weekend he had ever personally attended. Charles Barkley remembered him plainly as a gentle giant, someone who stayed jovial and continually brought genuine joy to everyone fortunate enough to be standing near him. Karl Anthony Towns, who affectionately called Dawkins Uncle Darryl, credited him directly with offering constant encouragement along his own path toward the league, thanking him publicly for helping him fulfill a promise he had made to himself as a child. 17 days after Dawkins's own death, Moses Malone, his old on-court rival, the very man whose arrival in Philadelphia had effectively ended Dawkins's tenure with the franchise all those years earlier, died of a heart attack of his own at the age of 60. A former teammate, Caldwell Jones, died of the exact same underlying cause at age 64, not long afterward. Researchers studying the issue have since counted at least 53 retired NBA players who have died from heart disease since the year 2000 alone. More than 30 of those deaths occurring before the affected players had even reached the age of 70. Some portion of that grim pattern traces back to simple, unglamorous biology, the sheer cardiovascular strain that comes from carrying that much height and muscle mass across an entire lifetime. Long after the structured training and constant medical supervision of a professional career has ended, it is a strain that rarely shows up on a stat sheet and almost never gets discussed during a player's actual career, when the size that makes him dangerous on the court is simply treated as an asset, not as a long-term liability quietly accumulating in the background. Larry Bird, who played both alongside and against many of these same men over the years, has said publicly that he routinely warns his own wife that very few genuine 7-footers live past the age of 75. An unsettling statistical reality he came to understand firsthand. Some of it, according to the researchers who study this pattern closely, is something more distinctly human in nature, a particular kind of invincibility that elite athletes often carry forward with them for years after their games have ended, leading more than a few of them to quietly skip the preventative cardiac screenings that might otherwise have caught the warning signs in time to make a real difference. In the direct wake of these specific losses, the NBA itself, working together with its Retired Players Association, began pushing for standardized cardiovascular testing among former players. A quiet but genuinely lasting policy consequence of a single difficult season that took several of the league's biggest and most beloved men far too soon. It is a strange kind of legacy for a man remembered mostly for laughter and broken glass, to also leave behind a policy shift born out of grief, designed to protect the next generation of giants from the same quiet danger that had been building inside their own bodies the whole time, mostly unnoticed while the world only ever saw the dunks. Every single time a player rises up for a dunk today, anywhere in the world, and the rim simply bends under the impact, absorbs the force cleanly, and then snaps calmly back into its original position, without a single shard of glass hitting the floor. That is Daryl Dawkins, in a very real sense, still out there on the court. A teenager who could not afford to wait patiently through 4 years of college. A young professional who paid his dues quietly on the bench for 2 full seasons before anyone gave him a real chance. A player who broke 2 separate backboards before the league finally figured out how to engineer its way around him entirely. He never matched Moses Malone's rebounding totals, not even close, and he never got the full fair opportunity to prove or disprove what those early comparisons to Wilt Chamberlain had implicitly promised about his ceiling as a player. But he permanently changed the literal equipment that every single basketball player on earth now plays with, every single day, in every gym, at every level of the sport. He also gave an entire generation of powerful players who came after him, beginning most visibly with Shaquille O'Neal, a shared name to call themselves by, Sons of Chocolate Thunder, carrying forward a legacy that had nothing whatsoever to do with rebounding averages or all-star selections. And the people who actually knew him personally tend to remember him today far less for the broken glass scattered across various hardwood floors, and far more for the booming laugh that reliably came right afterward every single time. Without fail, Daryl Dawkins came from genuinely nothing, joked for most of his adult life that he had actually come from a faraway planet called Levitron, and ultimately left the game behind, having permanently bent the rims of basketball history into a shape that still unmistakably resembles him. He never asked to be anyone's cautionary tale, and he never quite became one, despite the hard chapters scattered through his post-playing years. Mostly, he simply asked to be allowed to be himself, loudly, in neon, with a name for every dunk. And basketball eventually had no choice but to rebuild itself slightly around that demand. He was 58 years old when he died. In more ways than one, the game he changed so dramatically is, in many respects, still busy catching up to him.